Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings, the podcast that gets you going before you get going.
Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings. My name is Ryan, and as always, I'm here today with my co-host Vivi. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the book Range by David Epstein. David looks at different people's experiences in the real world and compares the theory of being a specialist versus a generalist. So let's dive right into it. One example he gives is two athletes. One athlete practiced golf since he was, 2 years old, became one of the best golfers in history. You may know him as Tiger Woods. And then the other athlete played a bunch of different sports. He was into skiing, wrestling, swimming, skateboarding, basketball, tennis, soccer. And he didn't specialize until he was about 16 or 17. So by this time, many of his peers already had special strength coaches, special nutrition coaches, were very specialized athletes. But he still turned out okay. His name was Roger Federer. So this book looks at different examples of the specialist versus the generalist. And its point is, in today's world, when we're trying to solve a lot of separate or complex issues, that being a generalist and being able to pull from many different experiences or different knowledge from different disciplines can be very beneficial. So to go into a little more detail, David talks about kind learning environments versus wicked learning environments. So kind learning environments are when you know the rules of the game and things don't change. So this would be things such as golf or chess. So when you make a move in chess, you know what the rules are. You know where the pieces can move, and that's not going to change. So that's what he calls a kind learning environment. A wicked learning environment is somewhere where it's a little more dynamic and rules do change. So maybe a wicked learning environment would be trying to cure a disease, or maybe trying to predict how well a business is going to do. So the rules for this, it's not quite as clear, and they also change. For example, new technologies are invented, and that could really change how well a business may or may not do. So David's point throughout this book is that specialists are very good for kind learning environments, where the rules of the game are always the same. So he uses the example of Tiger Woods and golf. His argument, though, is for wicked learning environments where things can be more dynamic and we don't exactly know how well it's going to play out, that being a little more of a generalist and having different backgrounds and being able to pull from different disciplines or different experiences can be quite an advantage.
I like how you mentioned the difference between Roger Federer and Tiger Woods, right, to illustrate the difference between generalists and specialists and how they can work out in their own respective ways. However, going forward, I don't think that necessarily it's a book to convince you that generalists are the way that we should kind of, go about living our worlds and how we should pursue everything. I think it's a good explanation how there's different sides to the benefits of having general knowledge for certain things, but also in this world, it is the reality that specialists are also very needed in a lot of settings as well. I do like how by being a generalist, though, you have various insights into different things. And because of that, one of the points I liked in this book was when it talks about how forecasters or people who have the better tool or ability to look in the future to predict how things are going to work, need to have active open-mindedness. And you really only gain that active open-mindedness by having an ability to understand different things from different sectors and combining it into your own ideas. I like that because David says that is the way that they view their own ideas, as a hypothesis that needs to be tested. So they try to disprove their own ideas and try to falsify their own ideas by being a generalist and having all this various knowledge. And so I definitely like that perspective because it brings in a scientific model into criticizing your own perspective. Because a lot of the times when we're so set on what we think, it's hard to think of the other person's understanding of what we're doing or a point that we can't necessarily see. So I definitely like that perspective. simple way that David breaks this down is by calling forecasters who have the ability to look retrospectively or to look from a third-party point of view as having dragonfly eyes. So if you think of a normal person, you have one viewpoint, but dragonflies have thousands of eyes. So they see every single opportunity that's available, and then they can make a cumulative decision moving forward. Another point I'd like to add is through the exploration of this book and David telling us about the differences between generalists and specialists, he talks about best practices for learning. He talks about deep learning versus superficial learning and what the difference is. He also mentions that deep learning is produced when short-term struggle is sacrificed for long-term gain. So what does that mean? That means that you're willing to sacrifice everything that you do in the short term with the knowledge that you're going to gain in the long term. Whereas a lot of maybe specialists who are doing a specific task very special to what they're doing, let's call it, a heart surgeon, for example, are changing that valve over and over and over again. However, being able to have that deep learning long term over a broad perspective, maybe you have to sacrifice, the short term gain a little bit in certain scenarios to make that happen for the long term.
I really did like his point on deep learning. I think that's something that really stood out to me. More specifically, just him talking about really trying to understand the concepts of something instead of memorizing rules, which I think is so easy to do. An example that was used was this researcher asked people on the street a math equation, and they asked whether a over 5 or a over 8 is bigger. So 53% of the students guessed it correctly. So that's it's like flipping a coin. But when they were asked how they got it right, most of the students answered by specific rules they knew. So maybe they talked about cross multiplying, or maybe they were saying, look at the denominator and see which one's bigger or smaller. But by just looking at these specific rules, they didn't really know why these rules were applicable. In a lot of cases, they weren't. Like cross multiplying here isn't correct, and they got it wrong. But the point of the study was that 15% of the people that were asked this question used broad concepts. So instead of thinking about specific rules, they were trying to figure out, what does a over 5 mean, or what does a over 8 mean? And they all realized that if you split something into 5 pieces, those pieces would be bigger than if you split something into 8 pieces. So when they were thinking about concepts, they were more successful. And actually in the study, all 15% of the students that used broad concepts were able to get this answer correct every single time. So I think that really goes back to think, when we're trying to understand something, really trying to learn what's happening, why is it happening, and not just trying to memorize some rules. And I think that's a lot more difficult. It takes a lot more longer than simply trying to memorize something, but then it sticks to us longer. And then when we encounter unfamiliar situations, we're able to bring these concepts with us and maybe alter them to help solve our problem.
And to add to that, Ryan, on top of having the ability to think on broad concepts like you mentioned, I think another thing that David mentioned that I agree with, along with what you said about concept thinking or framework, is spacing. So spacing he refers to as a time between learning sessions. And he's found through Columbia University studies that time between learning sessions enhances learning, which works even better with more difficult tasks, which is interesting. You'd think that the more simple tasks, the better it would work, but it's actually not true. They found that pilots who spaced out their flying time, their training, were better pilots than pilots who did it all together in a short amount of time. Even goes to show that the longer the spacing between the learning, the better their prognosis was for the actual learning event. So the longer time you took between you learning something, the more actually you ended up retaining in the long term, which, brings light to short-term rehearsal equals short-term benefits, whereas long-term rehearsal equals long-term benefits. And lastly, to get an even better understanding of how to make the best learning opportunities available to you, in addition to concept thinking and spacing between learning, David also talks about tolerating big mistakes. and how they can actually create the best learning opportunities. This was also confirmed by a Columbia study that gave people the definition of a word, and then they had to think about the definition as opposed to giving them the definition right away. So, for example, giving them a word like frantic, they had to actually think about what that would mean, as opposed to giving them the definition, then asking them later if what they actually thought the word means, or they didn't recall the definition. They found that even by these people guessing the wrong word, by not maybe knowing what frantic means, by breaking it down to what they thought other words would mean relative to that, they found that by getting it wrong or taking that big mistake right away, it actually led to them learning more so at the end of the day, rather than them understanding the actual correct meaning by a definition in the beginning.
I think that's a great point, Vivi. I know myself for learning, I definitely remember the mistakes I've made or when I thought something else was correct. And after learning that I made a mistake, it's definitely embedded into my brain now. And I remember exactly, and I've learned from that. And I think it's just so much stronger. That wraps up today's podcast. I think Range brought a lot of unique ideas to help study and help learn. And remember, knowledge is power. So I think this is very powerful stuff to know. If you guys want to check it out, feel free to go to audibletrial.com/motivational mornings. You can get a free trial of any audiobook. You can even get Range if you want to hear it in more detail. So check it out. Thanks for listening and have a great day.